Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of this Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Dov Zakheim, who was the Undersecretary of Defense of the United States in 2001 to 2004, and the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense from 1985 to 1987. And he also is the author of the book that we'll be discussing today, is pretty new, The Prince and the Emperors, The Life and Times of Rabbi Judah the Prince, or Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And he also wrote that's through Magid, which is an imprint of Koren Publishers, and a previous book called Nehemiah, Statesman and Sage, also from Magid. So thank you, Dr. Zakheim, for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Nachi.
So let's start. I'll tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, as you've just heard, I've spent most of my life in the world of defense. I studied at Oxford, at Columbia, at the London School of Economics, got my doctorate from Oxford. While I was at Oxford, I actually studied for smicha. I got it from Reb Shmuel Valkin, who was a well-known Gaon. Basically, I've pursued life in both directions. This is actually the fourth book I've written. Two are about my times in the Pentagon. Then I wrote about Nehemiah and now about Rebbe. My late father, Zatzal, was the author of Tzviya Sanhedrin, which is used in a lot of the yeshivas. He also had what's called a kuntras. He had a kind of short manuscript about Vilna before the war, World War II, because he was the legal counsel of the Jewish community, but also the legal counsel of the last man who was called Rabban Shel Kol Bnei Hagola, the leader of all diaspora Jewry. His name was Reb Chaim Ozer Budzinski. My father was both his secretary and his legal advisor. And on my mother's side, I come from Hasidic rebbeim. So I'm in several worlds at once.
Okay, so obviously we're going to focus on the new book about Rebbe Yehuda HaNasi. I mean, how do you come to decide, you're going to write a biography of Yehuda HaNasi?
Well, it kind of was like my focus on Nehemiah. Everybody who knows a bit about Nehemiah, the first thing they know is that he was an official in a government. So obviously, having been an official in a government, that attracted me. But more than that, he was a kind of proto-modern Orthodox Jew, in the sense that you don't have to be modern to be modern Orthodox. Nehemiah lived a long time ago, and Rebbe is kind of in the same mold. There are certain things about him that really reflect a modern Orthodox point of view. Obviously, again, this is a man who lived a couple of thousand years ago. But for instance, he preferred Greek over Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of ordinary Jews. It was the Yiddish of its time. His first preference was Hebrew. His second preference was Greek. He, like his family, because his father, Shimon ben Gamliel, had the family learning what was called Greek wisdom. And it was something that most people didn't learn. The rabbi said that was because he was close to the government. Same like Nehemiah, the rabbi said a number of things Nehemiah did was because he was close to the government. But that was unusual. He was comfortable with people who weren't Jewish, and not just the emperors that I highlight, but just ordinary non-Jewish folks. He was a radical thinker in many halachic respects. And of course, his life, although he headed a yeshiva, he headed a community, he headed a world Jewish community. He and the Reish Galuta in Babylon were the two real heads of the Jewish world. Nevertheless, he had time to work on non-Jewish matters. And so he was really a man of many, many parts, which I found just totally fascinating.
Right. So you're saying it's relatable to you in that way. Obviously, there was no modern Orthodoxy. No, there
wasn't modern Orthodoxy. But the point is, in many ways, he pointed to the direction that modern Orthodoxy has gone. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So obviously, we'll get more back to Rebbe and specific examples in a bit. But just, I guess to give a brief overview of Rebbe, when he lived, and, you mentioned his father, Shimon Gamliel. I mean, people may not, I assume that most listeners have heard of Rebbe, obviously writing and codifying the Mishnah, but Obviously, other aspects maybe not. So just give a brief overview before we
Yeah,
go down.
I'll go through it briefly. It's hard to be brief about a man about whom you just wrote over 300 pages, but I'll give it a try. First of all, he was born in 135 of the Common Era, and the reason that I say 135 with such precision is because the Medrash says that he was born the day Rabbi Akiva died. Rabbi Akiva died in the Bar Kochba rebellion, so it's plausible. He died, by the way, on the 17th of Kislev, which only recently it just hit me. That happens to be my Hebrew birthday. It's just a total coincidence. And as I say, the book's been published and I hadn't even focused on that. He died in 217, so he lived a good long life. His father, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, actually disappeared during the Roman the rebellion, the Bar Kochba rebellion. Now, obviously, the Romans had a price on his head. When we on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'av, we say various versions of Eila Eskara, of the 10 Harugei Malchut, the 10 people, the 10 leading rabbis that were killed by the Romans, and he's one of them, but he's actually not. He just disappeared, and he comes back. That's how we know that he wasn't killed. And the Gemara tells us that. His Rebbe's had a kind of foster father, a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. Those who study Mishnah will recognize the name Rabbi Yehuda. That's him. And he was actually quite friendly to the Romans, and I think he significantly influenced Rebbe, which is why Rebbe himself had a positive attitude to the Romans. He had a childhood friend named Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda. The Gemara tells us that he and Rabbi Yossi used to get up to hijinks, which Rabbi Yehuda wasn't entirely thrilled with. So he was a precocious kid. He was very bright, and like some other bright kids of any generation, he was a little bit of a troublemaker. Nothing serious, but again, it just was a sign of this is a very, very precocious young man. He studied under Rabbi Akiva, who nobody was more anti-Roman than Rabbi Akiva, with the exception of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who also was anti-Roman. And the Romans, of course, tortured and killed Rabbi Akiva, and they put a price essentially on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's head. He was very eclectic with his Rebbes. He had those two. He had Rebbe Lazar. He was also, by the way, a student of Rabbi Akiva, as was Rabbi Shimon. He studied under Rabbi Tarfon. He studied under Rabbi Yossi, not the childhood friend, a different Rabbi Yossi. Studied under Rabbi Elazar ben Shamu. And there's an interesting story there in the Gemara. He was pushed around by the students. They gave him a very hard time. And the question is why they give him a hard time. My guess is because, he was privileged. He was the prince. Not all students were rich. Not all students were the prince. So, it was an opportunity to push him around. He also studied under Rabbi Yaakov ben Kashai, and Rabbi Yaakov is part of a very interesting story about one of Rebbe's other teachers, was Rabbi Meir. And the reason I say it's an interesting story is because when Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel comes back, that upends what had been a kind of standing order while he was away. At the time he was away, Rabbi Meir was called the Chacham, who was kind of number two to the Av Bezdin, who was Rabbi Natan. And whenever they walked in, everybody stood up and sort of, respected them. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel then comes back, and these two Rabbanim are kind of pushed aside a little bit, and it really bothers Rabbi Meir. So he goes to Rabbi Nassan, who happens to be the son of the head of the Galus, the Reish Galuta, who's operating out of Bavel, the Rebbe's counterpart. And he says, hey, look, let's embarrass Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and he'll be deposed. And you, Rabbi Natan, you can become the Nasi, you can become number one, and I'll become the Av Bezdin, number two. Rabbi Meir was very clever. He didn't set himself up as number one. He gets somebody else to be number one. But that way he moves up the chain as well. Well, this Rabbi Yaakov that I mentioned a couple of moments ago overhears the plot. And he goes to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and tells him, here's what they're trying to do. And what they were going to do was test him on a really obscure Masechta, an obscure tractate. It's very difficult. It's called Uktzin. It's comes all the way, people know about Bava Metzil, they know about Sukkah, but we just were learning that. They know about Rosh Hashanah, they know about Yuma. Even people who don't know much about Talmud know about some of the Talmudic tractates. Uktzin is hard for everybody. And so they were going to ask him questions about Uktzin, so he wouldn't know the answers, and that would be a good reason to boot him out. This Rabbi Yaakov overhears this, and he goes running to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and says, "You better study Uktzin tonight. Because if you don't study Uktzin tonight, you're out of a job." And so Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, of course, studies Uktzin, and they ask him the questions, and he knows all the answers, and they're embarrassed, and they're the ones that are pushed out. There are two endings to this story. The first ending is Rabbi Nassan realized he had a dream. He realized he shouldn't have done this. He goes and apologizes. Rabbi Meir says dreams don't count for anything, and he won't apologize. And since then, he is called Acherim, the others, not by name. There's only one other person who's like that, the very famous Elisha ben Avuya. There's been a biography of him, who became essentially a Hellenistic heretic. He's called Acher. But Rabbi Meir, who never was pushed out, he's called Acherim after this incident. So that's one ending. The second ending is Rebbe. So now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's son is in Rabbi Meir's yeshiva. He went to a lot of yeshivas, had a lot of rebbeim. Rabbi Meir only showed him his back. He never faced the guy. And it really, really bothered Rebbe. Sorry about that. Can you put... Sorry about the phone. That was Rabbi Meir. Anyway, so there was a lot of tension. Of course, you can imagine Rebbe didn't stay in Rabbi Meir's yeshiva very long. So, he becomes the Nasi. It's around 165. It's not clear exactly when his father passed away. And then he essentially becomes the leader of his community, the leader of world Jewry outside Babylon, because that's the Reish Galuta's territory. And he was very respectful of the Reish Galuta, by the way. His background, I've talked about his father, but he actually was descended from King David, but on his mother's side. The Reish Galuta claimed to be descended from King David on his father's side. So if there was an order of precedence, if they had to enter a room together, the Reish Galuta would enter first, which didn't make Rebbe entirely comfortable. But anyway, and then, of course, Rebbe's great-great-great-grandfather is Hillel, who becomes the Nasi, the famous Hillel who slept on the roof and was poor and all that. And then Hillel had a son, Rabban Shimon. We don't know too much about him. Hillel's son is Rabban Gamliel HaZakeim, Rabban Gamliel the elder. We know a lot about him. Even the Christians wrote about him, by the way. Then Rabban Gamliel's son is Rabban Shimon Gamliel. Then you have another Rabban Gamliel, and then you have this Rabban Shimon Gamliel, who winds up being Rebbe's father. So Rebbe is a true aristocrat. He's a royal. And that, I think, disconcerted a lot of the other Rabbanim, because this is not just a rabbi like any other rabbi. He's royalty. And Rebbe made use of it. Let's put it that way.
Now, I guess we can go in a couple different directions, but I guess we'll focus a little bit more on Rebbe before we get to
sure
to the other part. So the book obviously discusses all this. So I point out for the listeners, all this is laid out in the book. His lineage and all everything's different rebbeim, the yeshivas that he learned, of all those stories. So that is, and there's more, obviously.
Yeah, it's far more detailed than that, obviously.
Right. So another thing that's interesting, and you kind of alluded to this in the beginning, but maybe talk about this a little more. We'll get to, I'll put aside Antonious and that exactly for a minute, but just his opinion of Rome, and you mentioned he spoke Greek and he learned secular subjects. Talk about that a little bit. That wasn't the standard, obviously.
No, it wasn't. There's a famous Gemara that talks about a discussion between Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who was, as I say, more than just his teacher, his foster father, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who I mentioned was very anti-Roman. And then there was also Rabbi Yossi. The three of them are talking about Rome. Rabbi Yehuda praises everything about Rome, their engineering, their markets, all this stuff. He says they're terrific people. Rabbi Yossi doesn't say a word. And of course, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says everything that Rabbi Yehuda just said. He turns it upside down and points out how terrible the Romans are. So, for instance, the markets is where they have all their terrible women there and stuff like that. So he's always able to turn it on its head. Well, of course, there's they're ratted out. The Romans find out. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is called Rosh Kol HaMedabrim. He gets the lead in any discussion because the Romans, of course, liked what he said. Rabbi Yossi said nothing has to run away. And as I said, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai winds up with a price on his head, and he has to hide for all those years in the cave, and lots of stories about him that are pretty well known. The point is, Rebbe inherits this philo-Romanism, if you will, from Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and he develops a relationship with Romans. In my book, I have a photo of a Roman castle, or a really Roman, kind of a castle, that was walking distance from what probably was Rebbe's house. He interfaces with these people. And of course, with these two emperors that I consider to be two emperors, with the emperor in the Gemara who's called Antonious. Now, you might ask, well, how do we know this is all real? How do we know it's all true? My argument is there's got to be a germ of truth to it. There's a very distinguished British academic who certainly is not into Talmud per se, named Mary Smallwood. And she says, look, if there wasn't a germ of truth, they couldn't have told these stories. This was not a basic, this was not halachic. It was just by the way. So there must have been something there. And then there's Jacob Neusner, a non-Orthodox academic who's very prolific, but not Orthodox, who said, look, with all these stories, if it's economics or political, why would the Gemara want to even talk about it? This is all sort of by the way. Because if you look at these stories, they're all kind of by the way. So again, he develops, I believe, I think there's a strong element of truth to his relationship with Rome. And think about it. If he is the head of the Jewish community, that's how non-Jewish rulers have dealt with Jewish communities throughout history, through the head of the Jewish community. In fact, I would say this whole book arose out of a series of lectures that I've given at my shul. They're called Rabbis and Rulers. And it's all about the great rabbis who interfaced with governments. That's what Rebbe did. Our leading rabbanim interfaced with governments. They were the head of the communities. And so his relationship with Rome, it seems to have been less than purely formal. There seemed to have been friendships there, but it was driven by his role as the leader of his people.
And I'll clarify. I'll clarify. I think you mean is you're saying there's a germ of truth, at least, if not, more than that. You're just saying to those that say, "Oh, it's not true." There's no.
Well, there are different points of view about this, as you can imagine. There are people who say it's all stories. There are other people who say it's all true. You might have a little trouble when you talk about, for instance, that there was a tunnel all the way from Rome to where Rebbe was living, and every day Antonious would sneak through the tunnel. But all I'm saying is you cannot discount this and say, well, it's all stories. Now, if people want to choose to believe more, that's their choice. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't believe. I'm simply saying that you shouldn't discount.
So let's discuss, obviously, Antonious, like you mentioned. This is obviously, besides for the Mishnah, that's Rebbe, everybody knows some of the stories, probably we'll discuss some of them. So you mentioned, I don't know if this is unique to you, but you say that it was two emperors. So I mean,
Yeah, that's my idea. Nobody else has come up with that.
Okay, so I found it quite persuasive, very interesting. So talk about your hypothesis, and that's two emperors
Sure.
and who they were.
Well, there were a number of look. He lived a reasonably long life, so there were a number of emperors that overlapped his life. Some there have been articles by scholars who've argued that it was really the Emperor Marcus Aurelius who was a Stoic. The problem is Marcus Aurelius didn't like Jews and made it very clear he didn't like Jews. Then there are other emperors who just weren't emperors for terribly long. There was one emperor, Marcus Aurelius's successor, named Commodus, but he would have, if he met Rebbe at all, he would have met him when he was a 13-year-old. So obviously the conversations in the Talmud about politics, about philosophy, whatever it might be, it doesn't seem likely that Rebbe would have gotten into a conversation with a 13-year-old like that. Septimius Severus, who, by the way, was an outsider, he came from Africa. He did not come from Rome. And he was from Punic origin. And what's interesting about the Punic language, Punic is Phoenician, and Phoenician and Hebrew are not identical, but they're not remote. It's not like, comparing Chinese to English or something like that. And so and there were Jews in the area where Septimius Severus grew up. So it's quite likely he met Jews. It's quite likely he was able to some extent to understand what they were saying. But most important of all, he was friendly to the Jews. And we know this not from what the Gemara says. We know this because one of the early Christian writers, Jerome, explicitly said so. So now you have an outside source telling you that this emperor Septimius Severus was pro-Jewish, or at least philo-Jewish. And he visited Palestine twice. So the odds that he interfaced with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi are pretty good. His son, Caracalla, one could argue even further. Now, there are some scholars who say Caracalla is the Antonious, and whereas Septimius Severus does not have Antonious in his name, one of Caracalla's names was, in fact, Antoninus. Caracalla visited Israel twice, Palestine, I should say, and came near where Rebbe lived. More important than that, there is a Roman tale. Again, this isn't Talmud. This is the Roman historian Herodian, who, I think it was Herodian. In any event, the story goes that when he was a boy, Caracalla saw that there was a Jewish boy that was being persecuted by other boys. Not an unusual tale from that day to this. And Caracalla stands up for the Jewish kid. It's actually the Historia Augusta, I stand corrected. Historia Augusta, a lot of people question its accuracy, but it's an interesting story. It's sort of saying Caracalla stood up, and Caracalla was hated, by the way. He was assassinated too. But he stands up for this Jewish kid when he's a kid. And then it's Caracalla and his father who issue the edict that make the Jews Roman citizens. So these are two emperors who lived at the time of Rebbe, who visited Palestine, which was what the province was called at the time, when Rebbe was at the height of his powers, who have external evidence, not from the Gemara, but externally. And nobody will call Jerome a great friend of the Jews, who would testify that these two men, these two emperors, were friendly to the Jews. And the record, of course, is they made them citizens. I think that, remember, when was the Gemara written? 300 years after Rebbe lived, maybe more than that. The Yerushalmi was written after, we just kept the second day of Yontif. The Yerushalmi was written after the second day of Yontif was institutionalized. How do we know that? Because they talk about why we keep a second day of Yontif. That is already maybe 150 to 200 years after Rebbe lived. The Bavli is even later. So, as I say, germ of truth, something happened. clearly that it passed from word of mouth rather, that Rebbe interfaced with emperors. They knew Antoninus. They didn't know who Antoninus, what Antoninus. These are Roman emperors that lived hundreds of years before. So it seems to me what they did was they essentially blended these two emperors. How many of them heard of Septimius Severus or of Caracalla for that matter? And especially in Babylonia, they weren't even under Rome to begin with. And that's where most of these Antoninus stories appear. And so they talked about an Antoninus, but I believe it's a blend of those two. And I believe there's a strong element of truth to the fact that there was a relationship. Now, how far did it go? Did it go to, Antoninus converting to Judaism, which is one medrash, or the story of the tunnel, which is another medrash? Okay, if you want to believe that, you can believe that. But was there a relationship? I would argue yes.
Now, what's interesting about your book, which is nice, is that after you call it the road to the top, Rebbe, where you go through Rebbe's, background, you go the road to the top, Septimius Severus. So you give his, so people can read this book and say, okay, here's who we want, rather than just telling the reader, oh, this is they have no idea of Roman history. You actually go through that, and later on you discuss Caracalla as well throughout. Something else.
It's important because Rome, the relationship of Rome to the Jews didn't end with the Bar Kokhba revolt. They dominated Palestine for a long, long time, and it wasn't always bad. It's kind of the flip side of what we say about Persia. We're always thinking about Cyrus let the Jews come back, and King Ahasuerus was married to Esther. Well, Cyrus let the Jews come back, and then he decided he wasn't going to let them build the temple. That part we tend not to know. It was up and down. It was up and down with Persian kings, and it was up and down with Roman emperors. And Rebbe was on the upside, you might say. That was when the relationships were up.
Right, and then obviously you discuss over here the meeting between Rebbe and, as you proposed, the two emperors. I don't know if there's any particular of those stories you want to relate or how you discuss them in the.
As I say, he didn't meet them. He actually met them once together when Septimius Severus brought his son to Palestine. But one good story, I think, is Antoninus goes to Rebbe and says, my Senate is giving me a hard time. And Rebbe basically says, look, don't take them on at once. Take them on piecemeal. Caracalla really had a problem with the Senate. Pretty much like Antoninus describes to Rebbe. And he kind of took care of them. In those days, they didn't put people in jail. So both the background to the story or the Roman concern and Rebbe's answer are pretty realistic. And Rebbe had of course he had a good sense of how you manage politics. He had his own politics. He had rabbinical politics. I talk to some extent about some of the rabbis who were was it jealousy? Was it rivalry? You can call it what you want, but they weren't entirely in his camp. And one example of that is Rav Pinchas ben Yair. And there's a wonderful story about Pinchas ben Yair's donkey, which a lot of people know about. This was, and I have it in my book. It's such a great story. Pinchas ben Yair was really much more spiritual, and he and Rebbe really just weren't on the same wavelength. Rebbe invited him to his house. He never would come, and Rebbe would give him all kinds of reasons to come, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair would find all kinds of reasons why he couldn't come. But the story of the donkey is fascinating. So these robbers robbed his donkey, and the donkey didn't eat. And for 3 days, the donkey's not eating. So the robbers said, look, we better get rid of this donkey. We better hand him back. He's going to starve. We're not going to be able to do anything with him. Well, he comes back, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's staff or slaves or whatever, they want to feed the donkey. And the donkey won't eat. And they go to Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair and say, well, why won't he eat? He says, well, did you take Maser? Did you take the tithe? And they said, well, we weren't sure. It's demise. We're not sure whether it's Maser or not. He says, oh, no, this donkey is very, very strict. If you don't take even if there's a doubt about the Maser, you ain't going to eat. The story of the donkey reflects the spirituality of Rav Pinchas ben Yair. That's really what it's about. And it's a great story, a very frum donkey. But he was very spiritual. And so he wasn't a rival of so much of Rebbe as he was on a different plane, different level, different way of looking at the world. And so that's just one story about how Rebbe did have rivals for different reasons. There's another story about Rebbe Lazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's son, who had been by the way, in the cave with him under this, with the stand up to their necks. And he also was a rival of Rebbe's for quite some time. They finally patched it up, although later on, when Rebbe lost his first wife and he wanted to marry his second wife and he wanted to marry this man's wife, and she said he wasn't good enough for her. But there are lots of stories, and these are just great stories. And again, why would the Gemara just make this up? What's the point of making it up? There isn't really. So there's got to be a germ of truth to it.
Now, the other part of Rebbe, obviously, which is that you have a pretty big chapter, Rebbe, leader of his people, chapter 7 you go to. So obviously there's Rebbe who's Yehuda HaNasi, so the Nasi's in charge of all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And obviously, he writes and he codifies the Mishnah as well, which is his famous,
That's his legacy.
That I was going to say that is his Rebbe's legacy till today. Everyone is still learning Mishnah. Gemara is based on it, right? So, right. I mean, talk about what you discuss, there about how Rebbe and I bet we'll get to Psukim maybe after that. But
yeah. Well, the question is, why then? Now, the Rambam basically says the reason Rebbe wrote the Mishnah is because they just were running out of scholars. People were forgetting, and had all been oral law, all oral tradition, and Rebbe was worried if he didn't put it on paper or on parchment, it would all be lost, because strictly speaking, you weren't supposed to put the oral law into writing. I have a slight variant view of that, and the reason I vary a little bit is because in Rebbe's time, people weren't suffering. They weren't being oppressed. And that was one of the Rambam's, Maimonides' arguments. They were oppressed and it would all be lost. Well, they weren't being oppressed. This was precisely the opposite. But I believe that because they weren't oppressed, Rebbe took the opportunity to write it down. Now, why? Jews were, scattering all over the world. Now, we know that Chabad is everywhere because Jews are everywhere. Well, in the Middle East, at that time, Jews were all over the place. They were in North Africa. They were in the islands of the Mediterranean like Malta. Of course, they were in Babylonia. They were in loads and loads of places. And Rebbe, by the way, was answering questions from these places. He was the equivalent of, say, a Reb Moshe Feinstein, who got questions from all over the world. He was getting questions from all over the Jewish world, even from some parts of Babylonia, which, strictly speaking, should have been addressed to the Reish Galuta. So he had a real sense of the spread of the Jewish world. There simply weren't enough Rabbanim, in my view, to go out and teach everything to everybody. It was going to be lost. And somehow this had to be preserved for posterity, so that no matter where a Jew was, like today, no matter where a Jew is, he or she can do Daf Yomi. Well, if you didn't have a Mishnah, you wouldn't have had a Gemara, and we wouldn't have a Daf Yomi. So it goes all the way back to Rebbe, and it goes to this: what is the power of Daf Yomi? The power of Daf Yomi is that Jews everywhere in the world can be studying the same daf, the same page of Talmud, wherever they are on the same day. That, I think, is what motivated him, to have everyone have the same Mishnah wherever they were. And of course, if they had questions, they could address themselves to rabbis, but to simply study it and know it and have it. And there's one other thing, too, that I think is important. Why does the Mishnah have minority opinions? Okay, he should have just said, like the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't give minority opinions. The Rambam says this is the code. The Shulchan Aruch, this is the code. This is it. Why does the Mishnah have minority opinions? Reb Shmuel and Hanagid, Rabbi, his name was Samuel Ibn Nagrela in his secular life. And by the way, that I'll get to him in a second because it's so interesting that he was the one that commented on this. He has a thing called Mavo La Mishnah, an introduction to the Mishnah. And he says the reason there are minority views is because Rebbe wanted to avoid somebody who had a minority opinion saying, well, I've got this tradition going back to Moshe, and it's just as valid. And he says, well, not exactly, because we know that there are certain rules, like Rabbi Yehuda prevails over Rabbi Meir and over Rabbi Shimon. You have Rabbi Meir, you have Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi Yehuda prevails. Beis Hillel prevails with 18 exceptions over Beis Shammai. And the Mishnah talks about that. And so what he did was he wanted to say, yes, there are alternative opinions, but we follow a certain thing called normative rules. And that was very important. Just by the way, Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, why is he called Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid? Rabbi Shmuel the Prince, almost the same title. He was not only a Talmud Chacham who wrote this Mavo La Mishnah, which is in every shas you get, but he was the vizier to the king of Granada actually, as it's pronounced in Spain, and he was a general. So he was kind of cut from the same cloth as Rebbe, which I found kind of interesting. But in any event, that's the basis of the Mishnah, in my view, to preserve and essentially not just preserve, but to disseminate knowledge that otherwise would have been lost.
Now, something else that you alluded to in the beginning was Rebbe's opinion, his personal opinions and his Piskei Halacha, his own psakim. So, what are some examples of those? And that, in the book there are, you go through.
I'll only give a few because there are loads of them. And if you do Bavli, and now I'm actually doing Yerushalmi, Daf Yomi on Yerushalmi, there are loads and loads of socks. No way I could take them in my book, or much less talk about them here. But let me give you a few where the rule goes like him. He didn't always get it his way. And he would acknowledge very often that his opinion shouldn't prevail. He was being a prince, clearly, like a prince. I mean, I've been fortunate to meet kings and princes and presidents. And, you kind of see them and they do think a lot of themselves. But he had a certain degree of modesty when it came to Torah. When it came to arguments in Torah, he was ready to concede, which is a huge deal. But here are ones where the halacha went like him. Covering your eyes for Shema. We do it, Shema Yisrael. That was him. After Birkat HaShachar, we say Yehi Ratzon. That's his. He would say that every day. Now, he had it at the end of davening because it was the last thing he would say before he would go out and issue judgments or rules or meet with people, whatever. He would say, look, I don't want to wind up with bad people and wind up making bad judgments. It's been put up front, but this is his daily prayer. He said that you have to treat tefillin with respect, but not like you treat Torah. What's the difference? You can put tefillin in a bag. We do. By the way, Rabbi Soloveitchik said that, people take their tefillin off just before they say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, and they'll just leave them out. He said you shouldn't do that. You should put them in the bag. And he is actually literally following Rebbe's psak, which is you treat tefillin with respect, not to the degree of Torah, but you treat him with respect, and the halacha goes like him. What happens when you sneeze, when you cough, when you yawn? Rebbe said you got to cover your mouth. Now, health purposes, one thing. He was saying it out of respect. You cover your mouth. Halachas like him. It's important. What happens if you've got an itch? Say there's, I don't know, mosquito is crawling up your skin. You should not let your talus fall. Figure out how to scratch yourself, but don't let your talus fall. What do you do if the talus falls and you're saying Shmona Esrei? Don't pick it up. Keep going. Both socks, Rebbe's rules hold. Amen. A lot of people, amen, maybe I'll say it, I'm doing something else. Rebbe says this isn't a nice to have. You're supposed to say amen. Not everybody does that. The rule is often, followed in the breach. Another one. Suppose you're sitting on a donkey or a horse, and it's time to say Shmona Esrei. Do you have to get off? All the rabbis said you get off. He said, no, you keep going. You don't waste time. You have to say Shmona Esrei. Don't get off your donkey. Halachas like him, even though the rabbis are in the majority. There is a rule. Remember, davening, Shmona Esrei is really rabbinic. And there's a rule that in rabbinic law, you don't necessarily have to follow the majority. There are certain exceptions to that. There's a case of a psak by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, where the Gemara says you follow the majority, even though it really should be him because he's a makil, because he's less strict. But those are exceptions, and the exceptions are pointed out for that reason, because normally you don't have to follow the majority, and in this case you don't. The halacha is like Rebbe. Where is it? What's the relevant case here? And this will be the last thing I talk about in this context. You're sitting in an airplane. Do you have to get up? Not a simple question. Now, if you're sitting in first class, you can probably find a place to get up. But you're sitting in the middle, in the back, two people on either, person on either side. Do you get up? Rav Moshe Paskin, you don't have to. The only time you might have to is if, you have an opportunity to get up, then you get up at certain points of the davening. And not all. It's really, but even for Shmona Esrei, you don't have to get up. And that is the clear lineal descendant of what Rebbe said about sitting on a donkey. So his influence isn't just that he, put the Mishnah together, which would be a tremendous accomplishment in and of itself, but he was a posek. And his psaks hold to this day.
Right. He also obviously has some other psakim that we don't follow. Some interesting ones you mentioned. I don't know if you.
Well, yeah. There's the most prominent one, which a lot of people might regret. He wanted to abolish Tisha B'Av, and you can understand why. He had great relationships with the Romans. He didn't, yes, we didn't have a Beis Hamikdash, but still in all, life was good, at least for him. And so he wanted to abolish it. Now, this really drove the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, really nuts. I mean, how could he say that? So they came up with an explanation about having to do with Shabbos and all this sort of thing. Let me put it this way: even to raise the issue at all, just to raise it, shows you how radical his thinking could be. But he didn't win out on that one. He didn't win out on a bunch of others. I mean, there are many others that he didn't. But if you're really interested in what he lost on, you can see it in the book. I don't have to go and talk about that.
Right. I think you talk about the Yerushalmi also with Tisha B'Av. So yeah, there's obviously There's a lot more in the book, and Hanukkah, and there's a lot more in the book, and also in general about we mentioned here obviously Antonious and the emperors. There's a lot more Roman history than we mentioned here in the book, and you'll really get an understanding and a background for a lot of that through the book. A lot of the chapters, just like 2 chapters, I said, like dedicated to that, and then it's just sprinkled out all over. So I mean, it's essentially, just as we finish up, I mean, how do you go about like writing a biography, obviously of Rebbe? This is kind of like, you mentioned this kind of like the first one, especially in English, that's been written like this, right? Is it like you say, you take all the midrashim, all the Chazal from the Gemara, Yerushalmi?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a rather long bibliography. You've got both Talmuds, you've got the midrashim, you've got a lot of articles that have been written that sort of point to certain elements. Again, they were all based on the Talmud. I don't have a problem with the fact that all my sources are rabbinic. First of all, they're not one source. The Yerushalmi is missing Kutshim, an entire section. We have 6 sections of the Mishnah. Yerushalmi doesn't have it. The only exception is Tractate Nida. Otherwise, nothing. And others as well. So, and that's a completely different, the stories, even when the stories are the same in both, they're not the same in both. And the rulings are definitely not the same in both. Our standard practices, we follow the Bavli, not the Yerushalmi. So you've already got 2 sources right there. Then you've got the different midrashim, and you've got Tosefta. So you've got multiple sources. The fact that you don't have Roman sources or Greek sources, I mean, that didn't bother me very much. I mean, we have Roman sources for the Roman emperors. Do we have Jewish sources? Do we have Armenian sources? Do we have Persian sources? I mean, you take what you get. And of course, the more multiple sources you have, the more likely it is that there's some truth there. So the real challenge, frankly, is, finding all this stuff, trying to put it together coherently. I've always loved history. As I say, this is actually my 3rd book. And so it was just a matter of my 4th book, pulling things together. And having written a biography, as it were, of Nehemiah, I already had a feel for how to go about doing this.
Okay, so I will include the link to to buy the book in the show's notes. And just is there any? So now that you, like you said, you wrote about Nehemiah and Rebbe, is there another figure that you're going to work on now?
Well, I've had a suggestion from my shul that, as I said, this all was an outgrowth of this series on rabbis and rulers, and people have said, look, you're giving talks about all these rabbanim, maybe you want to put that together. Actually, right now, my inclination is to follow up with one of the next types of people. Again, great Talmidei Chachamim, broad-minded. And this individual was, A, he never got smicha. B, he's in the Talmud all over the place. C, we paskin like him in anything to do with not traditional stuff, but practical mamonot, practical legal stuff. He had non-Jewish friends. There's even a possibility he had a dog. He was an astronomer. He was an eye doctor. He was a Renaissance man well before the Renaissance, and his name, of course, is Shmuel. So I find that very attractive, and there has been one short book on Shmuel. It was written by Rav David Hoffman, who was the leading posek for Germany after Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. But it's in German. The translation on Google is terrible, and there's a lot more. So that's where I'm headed. But right now, I'm still sort of getting over the fact that I finished this one, Baruch Hashem.
Yeah, I think it's Mar Shmuel. I think that's Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. That was like his dissertation, if I'm not wrong.
It was his dissertation.
And he obviously is the Malamed L'Hayel, the leading Paisik in Germany.
And he's got some fascinating socks. For years, it was hard to get hold of it because he was very, very makil, very lenient on a number of issues. Not all by any means, but quite a bit. But there's a new edition out that has, of Malamed L'Hayel, and it's a fascinating book. It's actually in 2 volumes, and it's fascinating.
Could be. I mean, it's not now. It's not around. I mean, the old ones are able to people can get a copy of the used. But.
No, there's a new one that came out. You can get it. It came out a few years ago. I own it.